I just gotta wait for it to come up red. There it is red.
No, it's on. May Day. Oh, let's just start with a quick prayer. So thank you. Thank you, Papa God. Thank you, Holy Spirit. Thank you, Jesus, for bringing us to this point today, Lord. Thank you that for the download that you gave me. Thank you for the stories that we're going to hear later today. Lord, thank you for opening our hearts and minds to be willing to think a little differently than what we have been thinking and understanding. Lord, we just give you all the praise and the glory in Jesus' name. So welcome to the God is Proud of You seminar. Now this name, I have to give credit to Mike and Josh, who will be our speakers later this afternoon. This was, they came up with this name. It's actually the name of a song that they wrote, which is a really cool song, but we don't have time to share it today. And then the other thing I want to share is a lot of the information I'm going to be sharing is from this book, Walking the Bridgeless Canyon by Kathleen Baldock, okay? Now it is an older book, so some of her stats aren't quite up to date, but it's a lot of good information. And then just to bring, I felt like Holy Spirit wanted me to bring back out what I shared Sunday morning, the song that he gave me last weekend. I won't sing it for you, but it's just the chorus. This is it by Kenny Loggins. This is it, make no mistake about it. This is it, a new day is dawning. This is it, the waiting is over. And I really felt like that pertained to what we're going to be talking about today and where God is bringing our church. So I've been told my adult life that the Bible says that homosexuality is a sin, that it was a choice that could be changed, repented of, and the people that are in this lifestyle are people to be shunned, even considered evil, out to harm us and our children. And I think some of it is because of what John Master Giovanni says is the ick factor. I don't understand it, therefore it's wrong, because it just doesn't make sense to me. So how can it just doesn't feel right. But what I want you to do today is I want you to take what you think you know, and remember how I had shared a while back about taking thoughts that you don't want. You picture a river, and a boat is on that river, and you take those thoughts and you put them in the boat and you send them down the river. It's a really good thing to do when you're trying to go to sleep and your mind's racing. You just keep putting those thoughts in the boat and sending them down the river. Well, I want you to do that with what you think you know about the homosexuals, the transgenders, the non-binaries, all these people that are in a different lifestyle than what we are. Take what you think you know, put it in that boat, and send it down the river, okay? We want to start with a fresh understanding today. Now, our whole premise in this church is Jesus' command, love one another as I have loved you. That doesn't mean love the people in this room. That doesn't mean just love the people in our family or our relative, that family. It means everybody, okay, in the world. Love everybody as I have loved you. In order to do that, sometimes we need to change our thinking about some people. And so today our focus is going to be on what is termed as the rainbow community, the LGBTQIA plus community. And we're going to talk about what that means here in a minute. But I want to ask you, Would Jesus have hung out with homosexuals? I'm pretty sure he did. We don't know if he actually did, but if there were some there, I'm sure he would have, because he hung out with other icky people of the day, the tax collectors, the prostitutes. Okay? So just keep that in mind. And today we want to have the attitude, I may not understand, but can I be your friend? Okay, that's our goal, and we want to increase our understanding today. But our goal is to be able to be friends with people that are different from us. And our goal today is to get as much understanding as possible, including what the Bible says, so that we can more easily love them as Jesus has loved them, and to make them feel welcome and comfortable being in our church family. Hey, Brian, this is kind of popping. Turn it down. There, is that better? That sounds better. Okay, thank you. All right, so let's get into this, and we're going to move fast and furious because I have a lot of information to share. So first we're going to start with definitions, and these are the handouts that are in front of you just to help you, and you can take these home. So first off, we're going to talk about what makes us male or female or neither, as the case may be. First is sex. That's our biological status. It's typically associated with male or female, as indicated by our physical features, such as our sex chromosomes, our reproductive systems, our gonads, which is our ovaries or testicles, and our genitalia. Now, variations include extra sex chromosomes, abnormal genitalia, and so on, and we'll get into that. Gender is a set of social, psychological, and emotional traits influenced by societal expectations, what society says, that classify a person as being male or female, or even somewhere along the spectrum from male to female. And this is something that's sensed internally. Okay, so you have your physical characteristics, and then you have how you feel inside. And then the third is sexual orientation. That's who we're attracted to, who we're naturally attracted to. And that includes emotional and romantic attractions, not just physical attraction, okay? 7.1% of adults in the U.S. today, well, in 2021, 2 years ago, identify as LGBT, according to Statista.com. That's more than 1 in 20 people. So if you stop and think about that, when you're in a room that has at least 20 people, chances are at least one person identifies with being LGBT. That's lesbian, gay, binary, or transsexual, okay? Okay, now let's get into what these letters mean. So the L, that's a lesbian. It's a woman whose enduring physical, romantic, and or emotional attraction is to other women. Some lesbians may prefer to identify as gay or gay women. So they may not call themselves lesbian, they may just call themselves gay. Now you'll see that I have little hearts next to each of these. This came from gaycenter.org, these definitions and these little hearts. So each of these designations has their own color characteristics. And so I just thought that was cute and wanted to put it up there. So next, the G is gay. So this adjective describes people whose enduring physical, romantic, and or emotional attractions are to people of the same sex. And again, sometimes lesbian is the preferred term for women. The B is bisexual. A person who can form enduring physical, romantic, and or emotional attractions to those of the same gender or more than one gender. They can go either way. People may experience this attraction in differing ways and degrees over their lifetime. Bisexual people need not have had specific sexual experiences to be bisexual. They need not have had any sexual experience at all to identify as bisexual. It's just who they feel attracted to. Okay, and the next one, the T, is transgender. Now, this is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or gender expression differs from what is typically associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. So say a baby is born and the parents say, they look at them and they say, this is male. But as that child grows, they begin to realize they don't feel male, they feel female. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but that's what transgender means. People under the transgender umbrella may describe themselves using one or more of a variety of terms, including transgender or non-binary. Some transgender people are prescribed hormones by their doctors to bring their bodies into alignment with their gender identity. Some undergo surgery as well, but not all transgender people can or will take those steps. And a transgender identity is not dependent upon physical appearance or medical procedures. Okay, Q. That stands for queer. Now, queer is all of these, so I didn't put the hearts. There's like 8 hearts that could go with queer because it's just an umbrella term. It's an adjective used by some people whose sexual orientation is not exclusively heterosexual or straight. This umbrella term includes people who have non-binary, gender fluid, or gender non-conforming identities. Once considered a pejorative term, queer has been reclaimed by some LGBTQIA+ people to describe themselves. However, it's not a universally accepted term, even within the LGBTQIA+ community. So some people will call themselves queer and others don't like that term. So you just have to be kind of sensitive. But that's what Q can mean, or it can mean questioning. Sometimes when the Q is seen at the end of the LGBTQ, it can also mean questioning. This term describes someone who is questioning their sexual orientation or gender identity. Okay, the I is intersex. So this is an adjective used to describe a person with one or more innate sex characteristics, including genitals, internal reproductive organs, and chromosomes that fall outside their traditional conceptions of male or female bodies. Do not confuse having an intersex trait with being transgender. Intersex people are assigned a sex at birth, either male or female, and that decision by medical providers and parents may not match the gender identity of the child, but it may. Not all intersex folks identify as being part of the LGBTQIA+ community. And we'll talk a lot more about intersex here in a bit. And then the A is asexual. This adjective describes a person who does not experience sexual attraction. Sometimes shortened to ace, it is an umbrella term that can also include people who are demisexual, meaning they do experience some sexual attraction, gray sexual, meaning those who may not fit the strictest definition of the word asexual, and aromantic, meaning they experience little to no romantic attraction and or has little to no desire to form romantic relationships. And then finally, we have the plus. This just means everybody else that doesn't consider them straight, that don't fit into any of these other terms. It signifies all of the gender identities and sexual orientations that letters and words cannot fully describe. Now, some gay, lesbian, and bisexual people do not consider themselves part of the rainbow or LGBTQIA+ community. They see these designations as being extremists. These are people that don't want to get involved in the political side of things. They're not the ones going to the pride marches and rallies. They just want to lead a quiet life with their partner. They also don't recognize transgender people as being legitimate. So you might want to keep this in mind when you're talking to gays and lesbians. And I know Sheila, who is a transgender, and she'll be our 1 o'clock speaker, she has mentioned this to us, that transgenders are on the bottom of the rung of this group of people, because even the gays and lesbians and transgenders don't recognize them as being legitimate. And then I also wanted to talk about the rainbow. Now, the church has been such up in arms. They stole our promise. They stole our sign. Hogwash. If it had been the Girl Scouts that used the rainbow, would the church have cared? No. It was who was doing it that got the church all up in arms. So get rid of that, all about the rainbow. It's just, I think the rainbow is actually a great visual, because this is such a wide array of people, and the rainbow gives you all the arrays of colors. I think it's great. Okay, let's move on to the medical and scientific information. So, again, I was always told that these alternate lifestyles are a choice. Medical and scientific community has proved otherwise, though. I was also told that science was an enemy to God. And we heard this just a couple weeks ago by someone who, when Mike posted something about some scientific something, and they're like, "You're choosing science over God?" I'm sorry, but some scientists may be an enemy of God, but God inspired these people to these discoveries. And many scientists have found God through their discoveries. And many discoveries are now confirming what we believe to be true about God, specifically quantum physics. So why do Christians vilify science? Probably because of the theory of evolution. And I won't get into all that. But when that whole thing hit the fan with the big trial and the monkey trial and all that, the Scopes monkey trial, thank you. It was, creationism was pitted against science, and also abortion was in there too. And so it forced people to take sides. Either they were for the Bible or they were for science, which is not, it doesn't need to be that way. So I just wanted to, again, if you have that thing against science, put that in the boat and send it down the river. Okay, so now we're going to do a little bit of history. In the ancient world, and this is, time of Christ, that, all that. They didn't understand how babies were made, of course, because they couldn't see those tiny cells and all that. And in the 4th century, Aristotle said that the woman was merely a fertile planting ground in which the male seed grew. That if the heat of a man's semen could overcome the coldness of a woman's body, a male child would form. But if in instances of failing male dominance, a female would form. You have to understand, it was such a male patriarch society, and females were of such low value. It's crazy when we look at it now, but that's the way it was. Now, historically, any abnormalities in babies were thought to be the curse of God. And it's even mentioned in the Bible, Israel, they were denied access to the temple. But medical records weren't kept until the 1800s, so we don't know much about abnormal births prior to that. But we do know that when babies were born with genitalia neither fully male or female, they were categorized as monstrous births. And these monsters were supposedly sent by God as a divine warning and judgment on immoral behavior, such as a mother having, quote, unclean and unnatural sex during menstruation. Oh my gosh. Okay, moving on. In the 1870s, we had 3 revolutionary breakthroughs. Oscar Hertwig, who's a German zoologist, discovered that a human embryo was formed when the male sperm fertilized a female egg. This was huge, because before that they had no clue how a baby was born. Was conceived. Walter Fleming, also German, discovered that human cells had pairs of chromosomes carrying genetic code. And Carl Kurtbenny noted and grouped people together by the sex to which they were attracted. Okay. Male and female, he created them. Okay, that's what the Bible says, right? It doesn't say male or female. It says male and female. Sometimes males are born with ovaries. Sometimes female brains are placed in male bodies. And sometimes individuals are attracted to people of the same sex. These aren't defects or curses of God, but normal variations of human development. And we will get into the science of why this happens. It's very cool. Okay, so now we're going to talk about genes and epigenes. So genes, every human cell has genes that contain our hereditary coding. These genes, either alone or in combination, express a person's physical traits. There are an estimated 150 different genes that influence our height alone. Yeah, wow. Chemicals called epigenes they sit on top of genes and they act like on and off switches. They don't change the genetic coding, but they can affect whether the genetic coding is expressed or not. They can be temporary and untraceable, or they may imprint on a gene and pass the effect of the on-off switch from one generation to the next. And they influence a vast number of traits, including sex, gender, sexual orientation, and even disease. Now, as I think we all probably remember from science class in school, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Everybody remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Now, the 23rd pair, that determines whether a person is chromosomally, with the chromosomes, male, designated as XY, or female, designated as XX. Now, when a sperm cell fertilizes an egg, the resultant embryo receives chromosomes from each parent. So we'll probably remember that females are XX, males are XY. So the egg is going to have an X chromosome. That's fairly certain. The male sperm is either going to have an X or a Y chromosome. If it has an X, you have a female. If you have a Y, you have a male. However, some of the genes from the parents may have been modified by the on-off switches caused by epigenes. 1 out of 400 boys and 1 in 650 girls are born with abnormal sex chromosomes, according to Britannica.com. There are 8 million people on the earth. That means that there are 20 million boys and 12,307,692 girls that have abnormal sex chromosomes. The cell may not divide properly. There may be extra Ys or X's or fewer Ys or X's in the embryo. Now, some naturally occurring variations include XXY, X0, 0 meaning neither an X or a Y is present, XXX, XXYY, and XXXY. So in these cases, this 23rd chrome is neither female, XX, or male, XY. It is this third sex. It's called intersex. Now, intersex is a person with a physical sex characteristic abnormality. God created male and female and intersex. But this is only one way that intersex is created. Okay, so intersex, we said, is neither female XX or male XY. The female XX embryos typically produce estrogen that stimulates the beginning of ovaries from the fetal gonad. So that's the little bit in the embryo that's going to become the ovaries or the testes. Okay, so if an embryo has XX, that embryo produces estrogen, and male XY embryos typically produce male hormones called androgens that include testosterone and DHT. And they shut down the development of the female reproductive system in that embryo and turn the female gonad into testes rather than ovaries. So this is, so you can see that if something isn't working quite right, you're going to get these abnormal things. Between the 8th and 12th week of gestation, genes typically know to produce male hormones or female hormones. But sometimes epigenes can modify the genetic messages, which control the appropriate levels of hormone production. So this can mean that internal sex organs, internal sex organs are different. A female XX might develop testes or both testes and ovaries. A male XY, so these mean the chromosomes are right, but they're still developing differently. A male XY might develop ovaries or both ovaries and testes. And external genitals can appear strictly male or female, yet the person is neither male nor female, but they're intersex. But their chromosomes still line up, their genitals still line up, but their inside organs may be different, okay? Pardon? Yeah, the plumbing. Yeah, the plumbing is different. Okay. Okay. Oh, okay, that was right. Okay, so 1 in every 4,500 births results in a baby born with ambiguous genitalia. So they may be born with both a penis and a vagina, or some of each. Or it's very interesting when you start to study this. Now that statistic, 1 in every 4,500 births, that's according to the healthresearchfunding.org. Wanted you to know where I get these numbers. If I don't give you a citation, it came from the book. Okay, now, so that's sex characteristics, that's physical characteristics. Now let's talk about gender, how you feel inside. Now, so we're going to talk about a Dr. John Money. He was worked at Johns Hopkins University from 1951, university or hospital? Anyways, it's Johns Hopkins, from 1951 until his death in 2006. He assisted in many adult sex reassignment surgeries. He became a pioneer in the virtually unexplored field of infants born with ambiguous genitalia. Now here's where it starts to get twisted. He theorized that re-engineering the ambiguous genitalia of babies would shape them into happier, healthier adults. He had no proof. He just came up with this theory. There was no evidence of adults who had been born with ambiguous genitalia suffering mental health problems beyond the normal range. Now, he also postulated that a person's internal sense of being, male or female, was not established until the age of 3. He had no evidence, he just had this hunch that this is how it worked. He said, this is a quote, "It seems that every child is born with some predisposition to go both ways. Which way it finally goes is determined by its environment." And that's what's called nurture over nature. Now we'll see this thought process carries itself into our current. But as I said, it was all theories. There was no scientific studies, no proof that this was true. Now, this theory has long been dismissed in the scientific community, but it persists in some conservative circles where a person's environment is blamed as the reason a person might be gay or transgender. And we've heard this not too long ago from a well-known pastor in this area who, a mutual friend had a son who was gay, and he's like, oh, it was just the dad. He wasn't manly enough, and that's why. Yeah. Oh, Jesus, right. So I know this mentality still persists, and this is one of the things we're trying to get rid of today. Uh-oh. Okay, there we go. My iPad did something crazy. Okay, because of this theory, that children are genderless before the age of 3, doctors began doing routine surgeries to correct ambiguous genitals on infants. If an infant's genitals were not clearly male or female, the doctors were taught to make their sex of the baby decision based on the length of the penis. More males were created than were boys because it was easier to dig a hole than build a pole. That's, sad but true. Parents were instructed to raise the child as the sex and gender rule correlating with the corrective surgery. Many doctors didn't tell parents what the birth complications were or gave options to them. They cut first and told later, if at all. This practice continued until the late 1990s, when in 1997, Dr. Money was finally exposed as a fraud. Now, all that information I just gave you is very close to us, and I'll explain why later. Okay, so the body of evidence collected over several decades from adults who underwent not unnecessary and wrong gender assignment and sex reassignment surgeries teaches us that trying to match gender to genitals should not be a standard. They don't necessarily align. The attempt to change what is natural and inborn in a person has devastating effects on lives. Corrective genital surgery was done in at least 1 in every 1,000 births. At least 250,000 Americans now over 18 years of age were subjected to these flawed, unethical, and standard practices. Many children were raised in genders unnatural to them. And here's the really sad part. About half of children with ambiguous genitalia that have surgery to correct it wind up with sexually sensitive tissue that has withered or died. So it permanently destroys that part of their life. All right. Klinefelter syndrome. One of 31 known intersex conditions is called Klinefelter's, and it's named after the doctor that figured it out. And it's where you have an XXY. 1 in 500 baby boys are born with this condition, according to Merck Manual. Before the new standards, virtually all Klinefelter babies were raised as girls. Now 2/3 are being raised as boys. In 2006, new medical standards of care for intersex babies were established. Okay, keep that in mind. 2006. The new medical standards for care of intersex babies were established. Because gender doesn't manifest until usually by 3, so it was in there. What Dr. Money said was wrong. It was, you're born with your gender, okay? But it doesn't show up until you're 3, universally by age 6. Experts recommend that parents wait until the child manifests their natural innate gender. This is Klinefelter syndrome babies, okay? So now they're saying if when a baby's born and they recognize it as having Klinefelter's, then they tell their parents, don't call it a boy or girl until the child kind of, you'll be able to tell. Do they want to play with dolls? Do they want to play with trucks? Are they rough and tumble? Are they, do they like to wear dresses? You know. Now, this can be difficult on parents, but it can save the intersex person from a life of frustration and mental and emotional anguish. Now, here's where it gets personal. Our son David was born with Klinefelter syndrome. We didn't know it because we home birthed. We believe God saved his life because of all this stuff that, where they just went in and changed the sex. So, I mean, he looked like a boy. We called him a boy, and he was a boy. He is a boy, male. And he grew up. We found out when he was a late teenager that after having a medical emergency and you went into the emergency room, the doctor said, you need to take him to a endocrinologist. And the endocrinologist took one look at him and knew, because all Klinefelters have this similar characteristic. They're thin, they cannot put on weight, they're just skin and bones, very long, tall, and then they have other things, which David, it was a little bit of a challenge raising him until I understood why. Because they have a one-track mind. So if I would tell David, okay, I need you to take out the garbage, feed the dog, and clean your room, by the time he took out the garbage, the other two were gone. Just gone. And, as a parent, that can be a little frustrating, but it was all good. But David, we love you. I know you're watching today. You're awesome. David is one of the most awesome people that we know. And he's married to Melissa. And interestingly enough, Melissa has come to realize she's bisexual. Cool. It's very, very cool. So she said, it didn't matter if David had been raised as a girl, I would still love him. So, okay. Onward and upward. Transgender. Okay. Now, transgender is when gender and sex are not in alignment. Now, 99.4% of people, they are aligned, what we call cisgender. Their physical characteristics are male, and they feel male on the inside. 0.6% are transgender, are transgender last year, according to Gallup.com. Now, when I throw out these terms, keep in mind they're probably low just because a lot of people won't admit that they're in one of these categories. When they fill out these surveys, they don't really put the truth on just because they either don't want to admit it to themselves or they just, for whatever reason, they don't admit it. So I believe these percentages are probably low in all of these statistics. But according to Gallup.com, they did this survey, and 0.6% are transgender. Now, those who experience dissonance between their birth sex and their internal sense of gender. But that's still 1.64 million people over the age of 13 in the United States today. Now, of young adults under 30, 3.1% say that they are transgender. And you have to understand that today's society, that stigma is not there anymore. So the young people are much more ready to say, yes, I am, than us older folk who still feel, especially if we grew up in the church, we still feel, I'm a sinner, I'm horrible. Now, gender is believed to be established as a result of the release of hormones during fetal development once the biological sex is set in the 4th month. So you have these hormones coming in, it sets the physical characteristics. Then there's another release of hormones, if I understand it correct. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but this is the way I understand it. There's another release of hormones that sets the gender. Now, the amount or lack of particular hormones released may be enough to establish the genitals of one sex or the other, but not enough to genderize the brain to match the sex. Okay? Okay. We're doing really good. Okay, so I'm going to read a story that really, really touched my heart. Out of this book, page 204. Lisa was born Santiago Salazar in the early 1950s in Colombia. Grew up in California with the nickname Jim and now lives in Vancouver, British Columbia. Ever since Lisa can remember, she felt a disconnect with her body. Now, this is a quote. From my earliest memory, I felt something was amiss. I didn't like to see my private parts and avoided looking down when I was naked. I distinctly remember sitting in the bathtub in 3 inches of water and carefully laying a washcloth over my genitals to hide them from my eyes as I played with my bath toys. I surmise I could not have been more than 3 years old at the time. This feeling that something wasn't right wasn't based on me having seen a girl's body and deciding I had extra parts. I was probably 10 years old before I ever saw an image in a textbook of what a girl's body looked like. By the time I understood what some of the anatomical differences were, I was already estranged from my body. So where did this disconnection come from, and what did it mean? The few times I tried getting answers, I didn't have the language for it. The questions kept piling up inside, but I just kept my mouth shut. My childhood prayers to wake up as a girl had been abandoned by high school, and I started to most fear that someone might find out how messed up I felt inside. I was careful not to say anything or ask any questions that could betray my secret struggle. I even worried when I had sleepovers with friends that I might talk in my sleep and say something and my life would be over. Adding to the confusion, I thought, if I am really a girl, then I should be attracted to boys. But I wasn't attracted to boys. When Jim was a junior at San Jose State, he became a Christian and believed that with God's power, his internal struggle of feeling like a woman would finally come to an end. Despite his best efforts, those feelings never went away. Thinking it was an attack from Satan, Jim used his, quote, thorn in the flesh to draw closer to God. When he fell in love with a young woman he met at a Bible study, it seemed as though his prayers to be normal were being answered. 5 years into the marriage, and by then a father of 2, Jim still felt his body was the wrong sex. The shame and burden of his struggle were overwhelming. He reasoned that the burden hadn't gone away because he hadn't shared the secret with his wife. So he did. Together, they committed themselves over the next 8 years to raising their sons while seeking God in earnest for healing. In the early 1990s, Jim turned 40 and, full of despair and shame, sought help from a psychiatrist who recommended he go to the newly opened gender clinic at Vancouver General Hospital. Jim did not take the advice. As a Christian, he believed that God only created male or female. He chose to carry the burden for 9 more years and constantly thought about death as a way to end the internal pain. Finally, Jim decided to go to the gender clinic, hoping that 9 additional years of gender research had finally found a cure. Following a 6-month evaluation, it was recommended that Jim undergo a regimen of hormones and genital reassignment surgery and live as a woman. Afraid of the social, religious, and familial costs, Jim again walked away. 8 more years passed. The internal pain was intense. Jim was faced with a decision: transition or commit suicide. The psychiatrist assured Jim that given the choice, people would rather he be alive as a woman than dead as a man. This time, Jim invested the time he needed to study the Bible in depth to reconcile his transition process with God's Word. In 2007, unsure of when he would begin living full-time as Lisa, Jim began to disclose to family and friends about the changes to come. In early 2008, Lisa started hormone treatment and 6 months later began living full-time as a woman. By March 2010, Lisa had completed her surgical transition. Lisa's wife, who had been supportive of Lisa's struggles, waited 1 more year before asking for a divorce. For her, the marriage was over. She wanted a husband. Had they stayed together, people would see them as a lesbian couple, which was a deal breaker for the woman who had married Jim. Lisa, who identifies as a lesbian, still loved her wife and would have preferred to stay married. Lisa has covered the details of the entire story in her book, Transparently. So you think about how many people are in our society that have gone through the same or similar stories. And we're going to hear from Sheila in a little while, and to tell her story. People assigned male at birth, but who more closely identify with being female are known as trans women, male to female, MTF, or simply women. People assigned female at birth, but who more closely identify as male, are known as trans men, female to male, FTM, or simply men. Those in the trans community who work to raise awareness often refer to themselves as trans men, trans women, or transgender persons. Those are out there trying to get the word out. But those who want to live a more obscure life simply identify as a man or woman. Transitioning is when a person begins the process of expressing a gender not in alignment with their birth sex. Corrective surgery is referred to as genital reassignment or reconstruction surgery. Not everyone can or wants to go through surgery. Non-surgical options include implementing a combination of any or all of the following: change of clothing, makeup, hairstyle, mannerisms, or hormone therapy. Transitioning is highly personal. One of the major benefits of transitioning at a young age is to not be burdened by decades of wrong hormones coursing through one's body. Now, I'm going to bring up right now, I know that we've all struggled with what they're doing in the schools now about, teaching children about these alternate lifestyles. And I can see on the one hand, it can be damaging, especially if they bring it too early. But on the other hand, when you think about people like Lisa, who, because had no support system, did not feel comfortable sharing this, lived years and years and years in this struggle, if they can find at a young age that they can talk to somebody about this and get help, there are positive sides to it. So, I can see there's positive and negatives in this, but it is what it is. But I just wanted to bring that out. Now, the trans population suffers a disproportionately high rate of underemployment, homelessness, harassment, and family rejection. 41% of transgender people have sexual ideation, they consider it, or have attempted suicide. Many do not have legal documents matching the gender in which they present. In some states, it's not legally possible to change from a person's birth sex to reflect their gender identity. Some nations, like India, recognize transgender as a third gender. But 36 countries in Europe require a mental health diagnosis before legally recognized, and 20 European countries require the sterilization of transgender people. Think about that. 20 European countries require the sterilization of transgender people. That's crazy. Okay, let's talk a second about trans etiquette. How do you talk to someone who's a transgender? It's never polite, obviously, to ask a trans man or trans woman about their genitals. Duh. Transgender, the word transgender is an adjective. So transgendered is not the proper word. Neither is calling someone a transgender, okay? Other completely inappropriate words: she-man, she-male, and tranny. Those are no-nos. If unsure of a person's gender, it is polite to ask how or she would prefer to be addressed. Sometimes just asking their name will clear it up. Most will choose a gender-specific name, like Sheila. Always use pronouns associated with a person's gender identity. Okay? Okay, now let's move on to sexual orientation. Now, this is the sex to which one is naturally attracted. So we had We had sex, which is the physical characteristics. We have gender, how we feel inside. Now we're doing sexual orientation, who we're attracted to. Now this is not just sexually. This includes emotional and romantic attractions. Now for the majority of people, all three are in sync. Male, male attracted to female. Female, female attracted to male. Now this can be influenced by professional, social, family, or religious pressures. Now heterosexuality is the attraction of the opposite sex. Now 86% of the population are what we call straight, according to Gallup.com in 2022. 7% chose not to answer the question. Now this graph shown on the board, it doesn't show heterosexuality, but it shows everyone else. So you can kind of see, and we have a percent of U.S. adults and a percent of the LGBT adults. So those that, the last column should equal 100%, and then the others are only going to come to that, whatever the percentages of people that aren't heterosexual. Okay, so first is homosexuality, attraction of the same sex. Now on this chart, they show lesbian and gay, but together they're homosexuals. They're attracted to the same sex, and that's 2.4% of the population. Bisexuality is attraction to both sexes. 4.2% of the population considers themselves bisexual. And then remember, these stats are probably low because not everybody's going to admit it, okay? Pansexuality is attraction to people of male or female sex, whether their gender is male or female. So pansexuality means they're attracted to the physical part, doesn't matter how they feel inside. But they're not limited by either the sex or gender of the partner. Don't ask me about that one, I don't understand that, but that's what the book said. Asexuality is lack of sexual attraction to either males or females. They may experience romantic attractions, but they're not interested in sexual activity, although they may engage in it to please their partner or to have children. So that's 0.1% of the population. Okay. Gendering and sexual orientation may be influenced by the epigenes from the parents' chromosomes contributed, like we already discussed. In a 2014 study of DNA of over 400 gay and straight men, indicates that a section on the X chromosome, which is inherited from the mother, may influence sexual orientation. May influence sexual orientation, but there's not one single gay gene. Hormones in the fetal environment also impact sexual orientation. Now this I thought was very interesting. The more times a woman becomes pregnant with a son, each subsequent son's chance of being gay increases by 33%. The strongest theory why is that the mother produces testosterone-blocking antibodies in response to carrying a male fetus. These stay in her body and influence subsequent fetal sons, not daughters, just sons. These prenatal androgens that block testosterone absorption by male fetuses alter both the gait, the way they walk, and the vocal intonation of the adult male who will likely identify as gay. Hormones don't affect male and female fetuses in the same manner, so there isn't a similar increase in the likelihood of subsequent daughters being lesbian. Now, researchers are discovering in studying lesbians that sexuality is more fluid for women than it is for men. Women tend to be more driven by relationships than by the sex of the partner. And in our experience, now I didn't get this out of the book, I can't prove this, but in our experience, we found that trauma can also play a huge role in creating lesbians. Some of the lesbians that we know became lesbians after having horrible relationships with men. And they just said, never again. They turned their back on the men and they turned on the women. Now, whether they could do that if they didn't already have an inclination to be a lesbian, I don't know. Maybe there was already that inclination there. But I really believe that trauma does play a role, especially with women. Okay, in brain neurology, so this is a little technical, but the hypothalamus of a male homosexual brain has many similarities to a female heterosexual brain. They're generally more empathetic, they're better with verbal fluency, spatial distances, and language skills. And I know as a woman, I've had some gay men as friends, and they're hilarious. They're great to be around because they're like me a lot of the time. You know, they understand women better. It's funny. Now, lesbians, like heterosexual men, tend to hear lower pitch sounds and on average throw objects like softballs, basketballs, footballs better than heterosexual women. Very interesting. Now, 80% of youth who later identify as gay or lesbian start displaying strong signs of gender nonconforming behavior as early as 3. Most children will later identify as gay or lesbian. Most children who will later identify as gay or lesbian know between 5 and 8 that they are different, but don't know why. By puberty, they usually understand that they are attracted to the opposite sex. Now, there is no consensus as to the root cause of sexual orientation, but it is agreed by all medical and health professionals that it is not related to a child's postnatal social environment. In other words, how they were raised. There is nothing to indicate that parenting or early childhood events such as abuse affect either gender or sexual orientation. Feeling like outsiders and sensing that they should not talk about the differences they are experiencing often makes these children more vulnerable to abusers. While there is a higher correlation between homosexual orientation and becoming a victim of sexual abuse, the abuse does not cause the homosexual orientation. Rather, the orientation makes a child more susceptible to the abuse. Okay, what time is it? 10 o'clock. All right, is everybody okay, or do you need a bathroom break? We good? Okay. All right, let's take a quick 5-minute break, potty break. Get back on this. Now, our next section is history. So we're done with the medical science part. Now we're going to talk about history. Now that we understand why people are the way they are, now we can see how these people have been treated over the years. So in the ancient world, we're going to go back to the ancient world again. Sex was divided among 2 major axes. Purpose, was it procreative or non-procreative? In other words, recreational. And the role that one took in sex, was it active or passive? Now, the ancient Greeks have a wealth of literature depicting same-sex behavior. So this isn't something new to our society, okay? This has been, when you understand how they were created, you realize there had to have always been people that are different this way. Now, in the ancient Greeks, the sex that one was attracted was seen as a preference or a matter of taste. Okay, there weren't morals involved or anything like that. It was just what you preferred. In the Roman Empire, the division between the types of sexual behavior was based on the role one played in sex. Now, in the 4th and 5th century, This is a time of St. Augustine. Mainstream Christianity decided that any sexual activity, even in marriage, other than with the intent to procreate, was considered sinful. So, and this came from, I believe this has its roots in Gnosticism, where the body is bad, evil. And so this is part of that evil, sinful nature. And, you know, the only time that you really should do it is when you want to make a baby, okay? So the next one is then we're going to skip ahead to the 12th to 14th century. Now, the theologians in the Catholic Church strictly condemned all non-procreative sex acts as sins against nature, and I believe this is still true of the Catholic Church today. Now, the word sodomy is a term that means any non-procreative sex, any sex outside of trying to make a baby. If the seed was not used to create life, it was wasted. That's how they looked at it. In 1533, King Henry VIII of England passed the Buggery Act. Now, buggery meant sodomy, same meaning, different word. This was the first law that criminalized sodomy, non-procreative sex, even if it's among men and women. It was now against the law. Crazy. Now, the American colonies adopted English common law, including sodomy laws, which criminalized non-procreative sex of any kind. In the 1860s, Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, who had a degree in theology, law, and history in Germany, he was a gay man, or probably more a trans woman. He wrote essays about his attraction to men. He was the first person to recognize this attraction as a natural, inborn condition rather than an immoral act. He theorized that there was a female psyche trapped within his body. He unsuccessfully tried to have the sodomy laws repealed. So everything stayed status quo, but at least now we have somebody that's recognizing this isn't a moral issue. This is a physical issue. Early in the 1900s, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld studied thousands of what they called sexual inversions. Those are homosexuals. That's their term at that time. And concluded that it was a natural variation of human sexuality. But then came along Dr. Sigmund Freud, who is the father of psychoanalysis. As you can tell by the tone of my voice, I don't like Sigmund Freud. He postulated that sexual inverts, or homosexuals, were a broken person in need of repair, that through therapy they could become normal. Most of today's Christians use this idea. The idea that procreative sex was good and non-procreative sex was bad stayed until the turn of the 20th century. Catholics still believe it today. If the male was dominant, it was manly and good. But if the male was submissive, it was bad. He made himself lower than a woman and relinquished his masculinity. Okay, now in the 1930s, so we had in the Roaring '20s, a lot of things changed. There were a lot more freedoms and so on. And in the 1930s, new lines were drawn, distinguishing between sexual attraction. Homosexual and heterosexual as terms were developed as we understand them, and heterosexual became known as normal sexuality. Prior to the 20th century, the idea that a person might have a consistent, lifelong, exclusive attraction to a member of the same sex was unheard of in the general population. They were there, but they simply went unnoticed. There have always been men who loved men and women who loved women, but the cultural perception interpretation was different. Most men who loved men still married women in order to have children or to be accepted in society, and I think that was a big part of it. Okay, so again, going to the Roaring the Roaring Twenties also came Prohibition. And this is when organized crime set up secret bars and clubs where anyone was welcome, including gays. Sexual restraints were lessened in society and new freedoms emerged. But when Prohibition ended in 1933, so it's like the pendulum swung, well, when Prohibition ended, it swung back this way. And reformers targeted gay men and started arresting them for, quote, degenerate, disorderly conduct and, quote, committing a crime against nature or other lewdness. State laws sprang up that specifically criminalized sexual activity between men. They closed bars and clubs that catered to gay men. Gays and transsexuals were arrested in rising numbers, and so they were pushed into hiding in the closet. That's where we get the term coming out of the closet. This is when they went into the closet. Then you had in the 1940s through the 1960s, psychology did much harm to the gays and transsexuals. Many did studies with a few gay men and made erroneous generalizations from these biased studies, which were accepted by the rest of the doctors. They claimed that homosexuality, and this goes on from Sigmund Freud, homosexuality was pathological. It was a sickness caused by a phobic avoidance by a child of the opposite sex parent. One psychoanalyst, Irvin Bieber, conducted a study, again with a small group of people who were all undergoing treatment for major psychological issues. So they're already known to have psychological issues. That's who he chose to have a study with, and he claimed that homosexuality was a mental illness that could be cured. Other psychoanalysts took his study and carried it further, saying that the cause of the mental illness was imperfect parents. Specifically, a weak father and or a smothering mother, producing a son afraid of women and unable to bond with them. Of course, as we saw from the medical side, it's all debunked, but this is what they were saying. So this theory has been disproven, but it is still used by reparative therapy treatment by conservative Christian and family values groups. These doctors over and over again never looked beyond the patients in their care to the general gay or transsexual population. And so by 1967, Mike Wallace on CBS did a report, and he reported that 1 in 10 Americans viewed homosexuality with hatred. The majority thought it was a mental illness. 10% of the population thought homosexuality was a crime, and the majority were in favor of criminalizing adult consensual homosexual sex. There were more state and federal laws against homosexual behavior, and many state laws imposed subjecting gays to imprisonment or mandatory incarceration in mental health care facilities or asylums. And that's all I'm going to say about that, but if you read this, what she has to say, they did heinous things to these men. Heinous, horrible things to these men while they were in these asylums and facilities. It was just horrible. Then we had the lavender scare. Now this is all about rooting out gays from the military. A federal report came out that, quote, sexual perverts posed a security risk. Without supporting evidence, the Hoey report stated, quote, homosexuals are at risk for blackmail, a threat to national security, and therefore not suitable for employment in government, adding that they were, quote, found to be mentally unstable, morally weak, criminals, and destructive to work environments. This put the entire country on edge regarding gays and lesbians. And the other thing they did was they melded sex offenders and gays together in these existing laws. So you have sex predators and men that loved each other with, had a loving relationship. They were all put together as under these same laws and under the minds of the public and the media. There was a 1952 ban on federal hiring of gays and lesbians. It wasn't until 2011 that the military removed homosexual conduct from the list of grounds for administrative separation. 2011. Okay, back to our history lesson. So in 1969, gays finally began to fight back. And they started, quote, coming out of the closet. Coming out was frightening with the laws and the public opinion. But attitudes changed when people realized that someone they knew was gay. And indeed, for those to whom people came out, gay went from being a behavior to becoming a person. So that really helped to start changing the mindset. But it took those extremists, what we would call extremists, those gays that were ready to get out and start protesting and marching to get these laws changed and to get the society's mindset to change towards these people. Okay, now we're going to focus in on the church, religion and politics. Now, I've pared this down some because I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it's very interesting. In 1954, in England, the Reverend Dr. Derek Sherwin Bailey had put together a study of the inconsistent manner in which homosexuals were being arrested and treated in contrast to other sexual perversions. He differentiated between those homosexuals who had always been attracted to the same sex and didn't suffer guilt about it, he called that sexual inversion, and those who were aware that their actions violated their internal, quote, law of nature, sexual perversion. Now, I'm going to stop there and put my own in. What we have seen is people that are homosexuals that are in the church that have been told you're a sinner, you're going to hell, it's wrong, they're going to have that internal sense that what they're doing is wrong, even if they were actually naturally a homosexual. Okay, so I just wanted to throw that out there. So this Reverend Dr. Bailey went beyond simply reading the translated words on the pages of the Bible. He searched ancient scriptural texts and studied church and English history to uncover and expose long-held traditions and biases and their influence on sodomy laws. He concluded that the church doctrine had blurred the concepts of immoral perversion and consensual inversion. The actions condemned in the Bible were sexual excesses in which sexual perverts engaged, as opposed to behaviors of sexual inverts who acted according to their nature. And we're going to go into this here shortly. Finally, England passed the Sexual Offenses Act of 1967, which decriminalized sodomy, consensual sex between adult men. The U.S. did not do the same until 2004, 50 years later. That's crazy to me. Okay, now, in the early 1970s, now this is becoming our lifetime and some of yours lifetime, no preachers were really talking about homosexuality except one group in Texas. But on September 21st of 1980, W.A. Criswell, senior pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, preached a sermon on homosexuality. He completely ignored the 7-year-old American Psychiatric Association decision that declassified homosexuality as a mental illness. He completely ignored that. He quoted from a 1969 book that was full of erroneous facts to drive home his point that homosexuality was a sickness, a perversion, and a sin. Okay, now I'm gonna ask you, how many of you recognize this ditty? Breakfast without orange juice is like a day without sunshine. Do any of you remember that? Anita Bryant. She was the representative of the Florida's Orange Citrus Commission. Okay, she was America's darling. She was in the 1980s. She traveled with the Billy Graham Crusade, the Bob Hope Tour to Vietnam. She sang at the Super Bowl. She performed at both Republican and Democratic conventions, the White House, and Lyndon Johnson's funeral. In 1969, she had become the spokesperson for Florida Citrus Commission, and she made that ditty popular. It was on all the commercials. In the mid-1970s, she was living in Miami, Florida, which is Dade County. Dade County added gays to their non-discrimination policy. Bryant, afraid that they would force Christian schools to hire gay teachers, organized a group to collect signatures to fight the ordinance. She spoke in front of a banner that read, "Save our children from homosexuals." She announced, "Homosexuals are trying to recruit our children to homosexuality." This statement has been repeated without foundation from the late 1940s. Dade County passed the amendment, but Bryant and over 12,000 angry Christian conservatives demanded a referendum to rescind it. She started Save Our Children, SOC. At a rally, Pastor Jerry Falwell declared, "Gays would just as soon kill you as look at you." Anita stated later, "As a mother, I know the homosexuals cannot biologically reproduce children, therefore they must recruit our children." Of course, we now understand how the homosexuals become homosexuals, but these guys totally ignored that. They won, and the ordinance was repealed. But Bryant wasn't happy there. She took her gay as molester and recruiter message across the country. This also caused the gays and lesbians to get involved in the struggle for civil rights for the first time. In San Francisco, California, Harvey Milk, the first openly gay politician in the U.S., encouraged gay people to come out of the closet to tell their families and neighbors, this is a quote, "Gay people, we will not win our rights by staying quietly in our closets. We are coming out to fight the lies, the myths, the distortions. We are coming out to tell the truth about gays, for I am tired of the conspiracy of silence, so I'm going to talk about it, and I want you to talk about it. You must come out." He was murdered several weeks later by Dan White, one of the most conservative members of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. White also murdered the San Francisco mayor, like within a day or so. Yeah. Okay, how many of you know Tim LaHaye? Of course, we know him because he wrote the book series Left Behind. Well, he also wrote a book, The Unhappy Gays, What Everyone Should Know About Homosexuality. Now, because he was a well-known author, many young adult or teenage gay Christians read this book seeking answers. But, sadly, it was based on faulty sources. I'm going to read you a few of the quotes in this book. "Moral fidelity among homosexuals is almost unknown." Page 31. Page 89. "Homosexuals who want to change can marry and set in motion a chain reaction in which heterosexual experience gradually increases their ability to experience heterosexual pleasures." Page 149. "All true Christians should oppose homosexuality, for it is wrong and exceedingly dangerous to society." Page 157. "One major objective of Christian parents is to raise children to glorify God." Get this. "Many such parents would prefer the death of their child to him adopting the unhappy wretchedness of homosexuality." Page 193. "Many homosexuals and police officials indicate that their number is increasing at an alarming rate because they make it their business to recruit. As I have said before, if some homosexuals didn't recruit, they would become extinct because they do not propagate." Yeah. This book succeeded in keeping Christian gays deeply closeted and fearful, and it set the tone for the interaction between the conservative church and the gay community by escalating fear and paranoia. As more and more slumbering Christians were stirred to action, many new Christian political and activist groups formed. So this is, and again, I pared this down. I just took the most important things, but this is out of this book. Very fascinating history to tell us where we got the religious right that we have today, the moral majority, and all that. It's all in here. It's fascinating, but also deeply saddening. I just took the major points here. So let's talk about Jerry Falwell, moral majority. His quote, "Get them saved, get them baptized, get them registered to vote." His mission was to identify, register, educate, and rally conservative religious voters from all denominations. So see, what at that time, most Christians weren't interested in politics. They didn't even vote, okay? And his goal was to push back. So he wanted to get these people, these conservative Christians, out to vote, and to push back the, quote, degradation of the liberal culture rooted in such evils as feminism, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, and sex education in schools. Okay. But he quickly learned that fear of gays was good incentive for people to donate money. So that's what he really zoned in on, was the fear of homosexuals. And again, there's a lot of history here, but when we get to the 1980 election, we have the incumbent Jimmy Carter, who was the Democrat, and of course Ronald Reagan, the Republican. Now, when Jimmy Carter ran, he was backed by conservative Christians, and the Southern Baptists especially had endorsed him. He was, he was very forthcoming that he was a Christian, and so they said they would back him. But they gave him a list of evangelical Christians as suggested appointments in exchange for successful delivery of conservative votes, but Carter did not call or appoint anyone from the list. So when he came up for re-election, they're like, well, we're not going to support him, so they switched over to Ronald Reagan. Problem was, Ronald Reagan was divorced and remarried. And he had signed the Therapeutic Abortion Act of 1967 in California, which skyrocketed abortions. So they needed another social issue to rally religious voters. So they kept their focus on the gays and their threat to the morality and indeed the very fabric of America. And they got the conservative Christians all pumped up about the gays and how they're going to destroy our society and they're and all this stuff we've been reading. And now this is deeply embedded in the fiber of American Christianity and the religious right. Yeah, well, that's what the religious right is the political side of Christianity. And now we've got Christian nationalism and all this stuff. Okay, now we're going to get to the fun part, where let's get to the scriptures. And we're doing great on time, so this is very encouraging.
Can I send these out now?
Yes, you may hand those out. So everything I'm going to tell you is on these handouts, so you don't have to madly scribble notes. You can write your notes on that, and we're going to keep these in the back of the church, too, for anybody that comes in that says, what are you guys, doing? And we'll say, here, read this. So, if otherwise noted, these are taken from the Walking the Bridgeless Canyon by Kathleen Baldock. But we do have I got a lot of input from John Master Giovanni, and I found some things online and so on. So, let's start with Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18 and 19. Now we're just going to briefly tell the story. So God is ready to destroy the cities and inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness. The Lord came along with 2 angels in the form of men to visit the home of Abraham, who lived far outside the cities. As the 2 men traveled on towards Sodom, the Lord engaged in negotiations with Abraham as to how many righteous inhabitants must be found there in order to save the city from destruction. Aware that his nephew Lot lived with his family in Sodom, Abraham bargained the number down to 10. He and the Lord agreed that if 10 righteous people could be found, Sodom would be spared. Meanwhile, as the 2 men entered the gates of Sodom, Lot, knowing of the possible dangers awaiting visitors who stayed in the town square overnight, invited them into the protection of his home. Before they had gone to bed, the Bible says, all the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house and demanded that he send the two guests out so the men of the city might have sex with them. The sex the men were demanding was not based on loving desire. Rather, it was a form of gang rape intended to humiliate the guests. In lieu of raping the visitors, Lot urged the crowd to take his two daughters. Now, to us, it's almost inconceivable to imagine a father doing such a thing, but you have to understand, as true with many passages of Scripture, this one needs to be understood within its own time and culture. In ancient cultures, women suffered a low status. The rape of a woman, even one's own daughter, didn't compare to the humiliation suffered by a man if he were raped. But not satisfied with the offer of abusing the daughters, the men of Sodom persisted and demanded that the visitors come out of the house. Instead, the angels blinded the inhabitants of Sodom and quickly escaped with Lot, his wife, and his two daughters. Now, Genesis doesn't say specifically what the sins of Sodom were that caused God to destroy it. So we have to look and see where it's listed in the rest of the Bible. Now, Ezekiel 16:14-50 lists the sins of Sodom. Now, we're doing the NIV version. Now, this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them as you have seen. Now, we don't know what the detestable things refer to. However, in the 13 mentions of Sodom and Gomorrah after Genesis 19, same-sex behavior is never cited as the sin that caused the destruction of the city. Matthew 10:14-15. NIV. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet when you leave that home or town. I tell you the truth, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. That's interesting. Not a mention of sexual sin in there. Luke 10, and this is Jesus talking. When you enter a town and are welcomed, eat what is set before you. Heal the sick who are there and tell them the kingdom of God is near you. But when you enter a town and are not welcomed, go into its streets and say, even the dust of your town that sticks to our feet we wipe off against you. Yet be sure of this, the kingdom of God is near. I tell you, it will be more bearable on that day for Sodom than for that town. In 2 Peter 2:6, there's no male-male sex behavior mentioned. There we go. Jude 1:7, the people of Sodom had, quote, given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh. Now, this word strange flesh, in Greek it's sarkos heteros, means other flesh. Some commenters think that this indicates the flesh of angels. Now, no Jewish writer specifies same-sex behavior as the sin of Sodom any time over the 1,400 years following Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction. Philo, a first-century Jewish philosopher, was the earliest writer to directly connect the sin of Sodom to same-sex behavior, but his account is quite different from biblical texts referencing Sodom. Two other notable early Christian writers, Tertullian in the second century and St. Jerome in the 4th century, did not link the sin of Sodom to same-sex behavior. Augustine, a 5th century theologian, linked the sin of Sodom with same-sex behavior, but he also introduced the church to the imperative that sex, in order for it to be moral, had to be procreative. So, I think it's pretty well ascertained that Sodom and Gomorrah, we cannot say that God destroyed them because of homosexual behavior. There's just nothing there to really support that. All right, let's go to our next scripture, which is Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. Now, of course, this is from the Mosaic Covenant, which we know it's dead and gone. But people still are going to use this scripture, so we need to have an answer if anyone brings this up. So Leviticus 18:22, NIV, do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. That is detestable. Now that word detestable means tova, or it's the word tova. And Leviticus 20:13, if a man lies with a man as one lies with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable, or tova. They must be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. Now this Hebrew word, tova, is most often translated abomination. It's found 117 times in the Old Testament. In most cases, it's associated with foreign, cultural, idolatrous, or religious practices. Same-sex behavior was a common pagan practice and therefore strictly forbidden for the Israelites. Now, I found a really cool quote from a rabbi, and this is on Wikipedia, Jewish Views on Homosexuality. This is Rabbi Bradley Artson, Dean of the Rabbinic School at the American Jewish University, claims to have studied every reference he could find to homosexual activity mentioned in ancient Greek and Latin writers. Every citation he found described an encounter between males where one party, the master, physically abused another, the slave. Rabbi Artson could not find a single example where one partner was not subservient to the other. Homosexual relationships today, Rabbi Artson says, should not be compared to the ancient world. I know too many homosexual individuals, including close friends and relatives, who are committed to one another in a loving, long-term, monogamous relationships. I know too many same-sex couples that are loving parents raising good, decent, ethical children. Who's to say their family relationships are less sanctified in the eyes of God than mine is with my wife and our children? Now, what he refers to is we're going to find the same things true with the New Testament scriptures that are used to bash homosexual behavior. Okay, let's start with Romans 1:18-32. Now, this is from John Master Giovanni. Now, she talks about this in Walking the Bridgeless Canyon, but I just had a hard time wrapping my head around it. So I asked John for his insight, and he sent me this wonderful dissertation. So we're just going to read what John had to say. But first I'm going to say that what John said something very interesting. The Apostle Paul, when he writes, he talks in rhetoric. He first states what the people were saying. So basically, you're saying this, boom, 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 boom. Now, this is what I say, boom, 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 boom. And Romans 1 and 2 is basically that. He's basically saying, this is what you're saying, before saying what he is saying about it in the rest of the book. Now, those that take all scriptural literally are going to use what Paul is saying at the beginning as if it was Paul saying, thus saith the Lord. But really, he's just repeating what the people in Rome were saying, so that he could later contrast it and show how wrong it was. Okay? Okay, so now back to this section. The summary of this section of Scripture is not about sex, but about idolatry. And again, Paul's writing to the Romans from Corinth. So Romans 1:18-19, NIV. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. Now, this is what John says is a better translation, but it's like a literal translation. If you took the Greek and translated it literally, revealed for the reason of God's passion from heaven upon all lack of reverence and injustice of mankind, that which is truth, not concealed, in injustice it holds back, on the account that what is knowable of God shines existing in them, the God for the reason to them has been made visible. These verses aren't speaking of ignorant, ungodly, immoral pagan people, but those who grasped the knowable God who was shining within them. But they chose to do contrary to that inner nature. And rather than worship the living God within them, they became unjust, therefore concealing that which should not be concealed. Okay, let's move on to the next scripture, next verses. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood for what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Literal translation. For the invisible, him from the original form of the cosmos' fabric, by exercising the mind, beheld fully that which is enduring, his miraculous power and divinity. Into them exist without account. On that very account, they knew the God, not in the manner of God they had no opinion, nor were grateful, but became empty in their internal discussion and obscure, unintelligent in their heart. Asserting themselves wise, they were morons. It wasn't that God wasn't within them, but they no longer were conscious of that reality. Notice so far, nothing has to do with sexual intimacy or intimate love, but rather a displacement of divine identity within. In the continuing verses, we find they then transformed the eternal God into animals. Verse 22, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Okay, literal translation. Alleging to exist as wise, they were morons, and exchanged the opinion of the incorruptible God into what is now similar to the likeness of mankind and birds and four-footed creatures and reptiles. Consequently, surrendered them God in base desires of their hearts to cultic impurity, to maltreat their bodies in themselves, who exchanged the non-concealment of God into falsehood and adored and ministered to the creation from the Creator, who is adored for ages, so be it. Now we are still speaking of worship and most importantly, focus of opinion. The word we usually translate glory actually comes from the idea of one's opinion or one's point of view. Thus, while egoistic man proclaimed they were wise in their own eyes, they proved their stupidity. This is the Greek word moraine, which is, excuse me, is stupid and foolish. It's where we get the word moron from. So rather than holding to God's opinion of who they are and who creation is to them, they exchanged his opinion for their own and solely worshiped the created things, rather honoring creation through worshiping the Creator. Thus they exchanged God, who is truly not concealed, and concealed him within themselves by only worshiping creation. Okay, if we move on to verse 26. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. Okay, the literal translation for this is, through this God surrendered them to pathetic passions, dishonoring who both for reasons women exchanged their natural use from nature. Similarly, both and the men let go the natural use. The women inflamed in longing for them, to one another, men with men, unseemly overcome, to bear down to the ground, in place of receiving for services as proper, going astray in themselves as promised. This section is the one in these verses where the LGBTQIA plus community gets accused of deviant behavior. But the verse isn't talking about sexual love. First, let's deal with the phrase for unnatural ones, paraphushin, or as some translations read, that which is against nature. What's interesting is in the event that the issue is just about not doing what is natural, but doing something that is against nature, or doing something unnatural, which is considered going against God, then God himself is a problem. Because Romans 11:23-24 says, "For God is able to graft them in again, for if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree." So without changing the nature of the wild, unnatural tree, God engrafts what's contrary to nature into the cultivated olive tree. Whoops. If it wasn't for the same writer, Paul, in the same epistle, one could possibly argue that different writers meant different things, but not so. Thus, in Romans chapter 1, are we really talking solely about sex, or are we talking about something else? In the Hellenistic Jewish culture, as also pointed out in 1 Corinthians 11, there was an Aristotelian social order. First God, then men, then women, then children, and so on, which Paul in 1 Corinthians 11:16 clearly adds, "We hold no such custom." There is a setup that's happening to the reader of the epistle by Paul. The section begins with those who knew God, exchanging the revelation of the Creator for creation, exchanging their identity in God within them and veiling it with their selfishness, exchanging the worship of the Creator for worshiping creation, exchanging the, quote, natural order of men and women for men over men. In other words, men forcing men into submission through sexual subordination, a practice that was done in both Eastern and Western cultures to declare dominance of one over the other, usually master over slave or conqueror over prisoner of war. As the rest of Romans 1 continues, we find that Paul keeps narrowing the field. First, it was the misrepresentation of God and nature, which most believers would shout, "Amen! How dare they?" Then it was about the worship of creation for God. And again, believers would shout, "Amen! How dare they?" Then on to upsetting the, quote, natural order to both Greeks, Romans, and Jews. And again, they shout, "Amen! How dare they?" Then Paul narrows the field. Verse 28, "And even as they do not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which were not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent." You can hear after each statement the Greek, Roman, and Jewish Christians shouting, "Amen, how dare they?" But then he goes on, "Proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents." It's in this moment you can hear the shouts getting very quiet and murmuring begin. Oh, wait, disobedient to parents? That's in the same league as exchanging the worship of God for creation? Paul continues, "Undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them." From the murmuring, it becomes shouting again, but different. Wait, undiscerning, unmerciful, all worthy of death? So I didn't forgive the way I should. Wait a minute. Okay, so I wasn't as loving as I should be. But that doesn't mean I'm just like those people. Paul continues. We're in Romans 2, verse 1 now. "Therefore, you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge. For in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things." For you, those who judge, practice the same things. But we know that the judgment of God is according to truth against those who practice such things. The shouting probably increases at this moment. Stop! You're saying that because I was a bit judgmental, I'm inexcusable? That's because I was judging by values that are godly and according to nature that I am condemning myself? You're saying that I am no better than those ungodly people? You're saying that I was exchanging God's order of things by making them subordinate to my judgments? Fortunately, the epistle to Romans continues and shares about our new nature in Christ. But if it stopped there, Paul would simply have simply said, yep, you got it. Those who judge are no better than those they judge. All right, now we're going to move on to 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. This is in the New King James. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, which is the Greek word malakoi, nor sodomites, which is arsenokoides, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners will inherit the kingdom of God. Now, in the King James Version, the word malakoi is translated effeminate, also weaklings, those who make women of themselves. The sensual, in older translations, literally means soft. This is associated with traits of women, as women were seen in the ancient world, morally weak, given to unnatural vices, lazy, unchaste, lustful, whorish, impure, and taking the submissive role in sex. Well, thank you very much, ancient world, for just totally debasing us. Okay. It was used to this word was used to characterize men who lived lives of decadence, partook in excesses of food, drink, and sex, were weak in battle, prettied themselves for sexual exploits with women, or even were too bookish. They read too many books. Also, men who fell deeply in love with women and lost control of their passions or neglected their business pursuits were thought to be effeminate. The worst way that a man could act was like a woman. Our meaning of effeminate is totally different, which is why the word eventually got translated as homosexual. But that is not at all the original meaning of that word. Now let's look at the second word, arsenokoides. It's translated abusers of themselves with mankind. This word likely means pederasty, or men having sex with young boys, which is abuse. Now we're gonna hear a video from John in a few minutes where he's going to really talk about this term, so I'm not going to talk any more about it there. But let's look at the next verse that uses the same word, which is 1 Timothy 1, 9 through 11. Realizing the fact that law is not made for a righteous man, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, for the ungodly and sinners, for the holy and profane, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers and immoral men and homosexuals, this is the word arsenokoides, and kidnappers and liars and perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted. Okay, so at this point, we're going to watch a video of Dr. John Mastrogiovanni's, who is our good friend, and he's actually on the board of this church. He lives in LA, and he's been doing these podcasts with Dr. Will Wheat, who's also a friend of ours down in LA, and they actually talk about homosexuality and this term. So I thought, rather than me just redoing it, let's take a look at them. So take off in Pro Presenter. There you go. The very middle bottom is the play button. Right there.
Thank you, Brian.
I took a, okay. Hey, Brian, move the mouse. Can you move the mouse? Move the mouse off of it.
What we think the word of God says about homosexuality, how I feel it should be toward those who have not saw. What is the truth? What was actually written? What did it actually mean? And when was the word homosexual added to the Bible that has caused problems in the church?
First of all, the doctrine of inerrancy as we know it today only came about in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Okay? The word homosexual doesn't appear in the Bible until 1946.
Okay.
It was then being played around in the world of the church back in 1934.
Mm-hmm.
So to be from basically 12 years after that point, it's then inserted into the Bible as an English translation of certain words that are from the Greek.
Right.
Okay? Keep in mind, the whole notion of homosexual, that word itself gets its origin from German, and the first time the term is ever used is in around 1890 by a German doctor doing research, and he was just trying to explain same-sex attraction.
Mm-hmm.
So he used that word.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that word never existed at the time of Paul. Usually, the word that gets branded that is arsenokoides,
Mm-hmm.
which basically gets translated now homosexual.
Mm-hmm.
Arsenokoides didn't really exist in the time of Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it doesn't make, and it really doesn't make sense that it would. And my point is that you don't find that word very common in other documents in the Greek world during that time.
During that time. Okay.
Okay, so that word winds up being put in there. We don't know from whom.
Mm-hmm.
We do know that, like Bishop Papias of Hierapolis, if I pronounced that correctly, inserted things in the Gospel of John. Matter of fact, there's a whole segment. We know some of these things. This is just, and it's in your Bible commentary, so I'm not telling you anything like that's hidden here, okay?
Mm-hmm.
As far as text, some of these textual challenges. But point is we don't know exactly how that word got into arsenokoides, but then it gets augmented into the word homosexual. But actually, during that time, the Apostle Paul, one thing he did talk about, and if you even go back into the Old Testament and look at stuff, talking about two specific things. Number one is what's known as pederasty,
Mm-hmm.
which is a sexual relationship between a mature adult and a child. Whether the child is coerced into it, which is still a type of rape, or back in those days, they were actually young boys, including teenagers, young boys that were bought as slaves for
Mhm.
sexual purposes.
Mm-hmm. What was Paul's motivation for bringing, because I know it's practice where he was ministering.
Right.
Was he showing the lack of spiritual insight? Was he dealing with the trauma that could happen to the child put in this situation? What was he dealing with, you think, in the letter?
From what we know, not just I know, but from what we can gather, the big issue about sexuality at the time in Rome, Greece, and in the Middle East, going back into Old Testament stuff, was one taking authority over another
Mm-hmm.
and forcing something to happen.
Right.
Whether it's through coercion, okay, so a child is not thinking about having sex with you.
Right.
You have to coerce them. So even if it seems like they're agreeing into this, you've coerced it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the issue. It's the abuse of authority. It's the abuse of a relationship that Paul was concerned with. It had nothing to do with two adults had same-sex attraction,
Right.
being together.
Right.
Nothing to do with that.
So the same problem existed then that we have today with
Correct.
pedophilia.
Correct.
And what Paul was saying, this is not Christ-like behavior.
No.
To use your adult authority over a child, to
Right.
coerce them into a sexual relationship.
Right. That's why. Let me take this to an extreme for a moment. That's why the preaching of God love you so much, that he created hell just in case you don't love him back.
Mm-hmm.
The notion of if you don't fall in line with Jesus and God, you're going to wind up in hell. That's why, if you think about it, that is no different than coercing a child into sexual behavior.
That's right. That's right.
It's coercion.
That's coercion. Man, wow. Good. So that's another veil that needs to be lifted off the eyes and minds of the church.
The whole mindset was because of the hierarchy. You know how it was in the Middle East. Times the women were less than a man.
Right.
Many cases. So the whole notion was the one who gets penetrated is less than.
Wow.
So what they would do, for example, after a war, and they would take slaves.
Right.
Okay. They would humiliate them many times through that practice, making them less than because I'm penetrating you.
Mm-hmm.
To another man.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's not a homosexual love or same-sex love. We're talking about the abuse, taking that authority,
right.
shaming, all that sort of stuff.
Right.
That's what the Bible was talking about. And there's a wealth of evidence out there that validates this. The issue is, for most of us, is that we've been trained to believe otherwise. Mm-hmm. And honestly, if you're a heterosexual, for example, that's your passion, that's your desire, and you get to think about homosexual desire, it doesn't compute. So sometimes what I call the ick factor goes into place. It's like, oh, that's kind of icky. Well, guess what? For a gay couple thinking about heterosexual sex, it's kind of icky. Mm-hmm. Okay, but because it's icky, we want to validate that. Mm-hmm. That if it's icky to me, here we go, anthropomorphizing God, it must be icky to God too. Yeah. And I mean, if you really want to go down that road, the whole notion of this physical world as we know it is more our creation than God's anyway. And what we are doing is restoring it back to his divine design. And remember, God doesn't have love. God is love, right? Love is not an attribute amongst other attributes that God has. God is love. And in certain cases, if you want to start thinking about it, if you talk about two same-sex people that are deeply in love with each other, if you're going to say no because the sex is icky, and then try to find a Bible verse to prove it, there's a Bible verse to prove actually that because God is love, God could be right in the middle of that. I know, hair just went on fire. But if we're going to be honest with a Christ-centered view and interpret Scripture from a Christ-centered view, we have to realize that in the Apostle Paul's time, before then, in the Roman Church, and I don't mean the epistle to Roman, I mean Roman as in the nation of Rome, these churches that were people that were coming into the church, I promise you there were gay people in the church. And no, they didn't have a deliverance service, like the way we used to do it. So it's going to be Saturday night gay deliverance service. Everybody line up and lay hands on you and get the gay spirit cast out of you. Yeah, really, how well did that work for you?
With that thought, for those of you that's still with us, that follows in this conversation. So, if I'm hearing this correctly, God is establishing love in the earth realm.
Yes.
And the word that came to me that helped me early on is the word acceptance. To accept someone and to love them and to help them where they're open for help was a mind shift for me. Because I thought I was doing things in a certain way. You got to do things this way, or you're not getting help from God, you're not getting help from me. Until God started showing me people that didn't do things my way that I would consider blessed. Like you always see whatever your terminology of blessed is, somebody living in that terminology or that definition outside of your belief system. But they're receiving everything you think a blessing should bring you. Right. And that arrested my attention. Well, how come they're getting their stuff and I'm not getting their stuff? Right. And so it caused me to rethink some of the things that I thought I knew and was certain about.
Recently had a conversation with somebody the person said to me, he said, well, I believe God accepts homosexuals, but then they use that old phrase, yes, but God loves you so much that he accepts you, but he also loves you so much he's not going to leave you that way, the way that you are, whatever that is. And I thought to myself, even if you believe that, if that's where you're coming from is, why are you upset with somebody that still has same-sex attraction?
Mm-hmm.
Because if they've been in the church 3 years and they still have same-sex attraction and God didn't, quote, change them yet, get your hands off that. Or should I get your mind off that? Pardon the pun, get your hands off that. Okay? Think that through. Why is it a concern to you? Well, it's sin. Why is it a concern to you? Going back to what we said previously in a previous lesson, if God's not sin conscious, why are you?
That's right.
Am I on? I'm on. Thank you, Brian. And that brought up something that I didn't have in my notes, but I wanted to mention. In a lot of these what I'm learning, and you can go online and find the same thing in these Christian reparative therapy groups. What people that go in thinking, because Christians that grow up in the church, and we've got some links that I'll put up at the end. There's some great videos. There's a video of young teenager Christians that have realized that they're gay. They're in the church. What do they do with this? And so on. I mean, they beg God to change them, like, kind of like what the story I read in there. And they go to these reparative therapies thinking they're going to make me heterosexual. What they find out is no, because you can't. You can't make somebody heterosexual. They just help them how to live a celibate life with their homosexuality. And the leaders of these that at one point said, I'm cured, God cured me, I'm no longer homosexual, was not true at all. They later admitted, no, I'm still homosexual, I just don't live that lifestyle. So I just want to throw that out. Okay, next scripture. This is very interesting. We're going to talk about Jonathan and David. And again, she talks about it in here, I believe. Did she talk about it? Maybe she didn't talk about it in here. But I came across this story from a rabbi, which got me on this. And then I asked John. And so, again, he gave me this nice dissertation. So this is what we're going to look at. So he says, there's no mystery that Jonathan and David were very close. They had a covenantal relationship, but not one of necessity, but one of love. There was no need for a covenant for kinship purposes or any other to unite themselves or their families except their love. Now let's look at 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 5. This is NASU. I have no idea what translation that is. This is John's translation. That's okay. Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered, and Saul set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So now we've got bunch of Hebrew up here, which of course I can't read Hebrew. But we have that highlighted word, that was that knit word. Now the literal translation is here. It's, and it was he ended the matter to Saul. Now, Saul's name is question/grave. And the soul of Jonathan, Jonathan's name was Yahweh has given, was tied or conspired to David. And David's name means hot lover. And loved him, Jonathan, like his soul. So Dr. John says here, I gave the definitions of the Hebrew names just to add a bit of spice to the text. The key phrase in the first verse is nikshara. That's that highlighted word up there, which of the approximate 62 times it appears in the Old Testament with its roots, it's most commonly translated 35 times as conspire. In addition to conspire, it's also translated as treason 6 times. The remaining 21 times it's translated confederacy, strong, bind, and only once as knit. As most of you know, Hebrew comes to us in the form of block logic. Now, block logic basically means the Hebrews will talk about something and it sounds like they're talking about different things, but really it's the same thing. It's just another side of the block, okay? In contrast to Greek and Latin, which is in step logic form. Thus, if this was just a covenant union or a yoking by it tying together or joining in battle, there are other appropriate words that would have been used. Shavar, meaning companion, partner, to join, or asar, meaning to yoke, to fasten together, a vow as in covenant or obligation. Nikshara presents something else. It is something, speaking of something deep in the heart that is concealed from the external world. It is something where two people are in a relationship together secretly. While on the surface, Jonathan and David seem to be really good buddies doing the bidding of King Saul, and you can see that in 1 Samuel 18, 2-8, something goes sideways in the thinking of Saul when he discovers that there's something more to Jonathan and David as covenant brothers. Consider, David never conspired with Jonathan to overthrow Saul or disobey his orders. When Saul's insecurities about David rose to the surface, the only thing Jonathan did, along with Michal, was protect David. However, the Hebrew word nikshara is connected to Jonathan and David's love for each other, not setting out to be contrary to the king. We know that through the life of David, that he had passionate sexual desires. We also know he would even conspire to cover up his sexual exploits. The most famous is Bathsheba. Not only did he gaze at her from the roof, but he also had her come up to his bedroom, have sex, and then once pregnant, have her husband removed from battle in the hopes him having sex with her to cover up the pregnancy. When that didn't work, David had him put on the front lines to be killed. There are other stories of David's erotic passions, but Jonathan is in another category. Before we look at the Hebrew text where Saul speaks of Jonathan and David, here is a forthright statement by David himself in 2 Samuel 1:26. I am in distress for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant wast thou to me. Wonderful was thy love to me above the love of women. The phrase, wonderful was thy love to me above the love of women, literally reads that. To me, vehemently, from burning fire, wonderful to me was your love to me, far from love of women. It is interesting to note that the New King James, the NIV, the NASB, and the Revised Standard Version, to mention a few, all leave out the phrase li miad, which means burning fire. They just say, wonderful was your love. But this means burning fire, or by extension, firebrand. He says, for the sake of the reading audience, I will leave out one of the definitions of the Brown Driver Briggs Genius Hebrew Lexicon regarding firebrand. Must be pretty saucy. Finally, if one struggles in believing a secret love affair between Jonathan and David, or that Jonathan's love was a burning fire that as far as David was concerned, it surpassed the love of women, then there's this. 1 Samuel 20:30. Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan. He said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" Uh-oh. Hold on a sec. My iPad just moved. Okay. So, there is the Hebrew translation. "And blazed up anger from Saul in Jonathan and said to him, Son, perverse, twisted self, the rebellious. Not knowing I, for chosen you to son Jesse, to confuse or shame yourself, and to shame, confuse the nakedness of your mother." Clearly, Saul is angry with Jonathan, but what for? If we simply go back 2 chapters, we find Saul seriously intimidated by David. Thus, to win him over and be faithful to this throne, he gave him his daughter Michal, but only after David was to bring him the 100 foreskins of the Philistines. But David brought him 200 foreskins and became more famous than before. Thus Saul tried to kill David and failed. But then it happened at the new moon celebration with the king, David was absent. David was absent. Is that better? David was concerned about the king's desire to kill him, so he wanted to stay away. For this, he relied on Jonathan for help. They secretly meet again, and the text says in 1 Samuel 20:17, "Now Jonathan again caused David to vow because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul." Finally, the day comes, and David is a no-show at the celebration, and Saul thinks to himself. Saul said nothing that day, for he thought, something must have happened to David to make him ceremonial unclean. Surely he is unclean. Sounds benign, but what would make David ceremonial unclean for a new moon celebration in the mind of Saul? According to Leviticus 12-15, it lists the following. Childbirth. Nope, that's not it. Michal's womb was barren. Infectious diseases like leprosy. Nope, that's not it. David is healthy, recently got 200 foreskins. A menstruated woman. Nope, David is a man. However, there is one that would keep David from coming to a new moon celebration. According to the 25-volume biblical commentary by C.F. Keel and F. Delitzsch, professors of theology, they note that this verse applies to 1 Samuel 20:26. In Leviticus 15:16 and 17, "If any man has an emission of semen, then he shall wash all his body in water and be unclean until evening. And any garment and any leather on which there is semen, it shall be washed with water and be unclean until evening." This could apply to sex with a woman as well, but Michal wasn't with David at the time. Then we see Saul explode his anger on Jonathan, knowing full well why, in his mind, David wasn't there. Saul calls to his son in 1 Samuel 20:30, twisted. Some translate this as perverted. However, most add the following to the phrase, perverse and rebellious woman, with a footnote saying Saul is speaking of Jonathan's mother. Why? Plus, the word woman or mother isn't present here. Saul actually says, son, perverse, twisted self, the rebellious. However, it's all in the feminine gender. There could have been other words used to call him perverse, but here's Saul's meaning is clear. Saul was calling Jonathan's conduct with David as something a woman would do with a man. If I were to embellish the translation like most of the translations that use the word woman, it would be better to translate the verse this way: son is a perverse and rebellious woman. The verb for perverse or twisted is in the nifl tense, which is reflexive, meaning turned back on itself. For example, the fish cooked itself. What Saul is saying to Jonathan is reflexive. the perversity and rebellion in the feminine gender is to and about Jonathan himself. Then comes the two words used in Genesis to describe Adam and Eve's intimate relationship. In Genesis 2:25, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. And there's the Hebrew. Saul will now use the same words to describe what Jonathan has done with David and how it impacts the family. Translation here, for chosen you to son Jesse to confuse or shame yourself and to confuse the nakedness of your mother. The yellows are the same words and the greens are the same words. Saul literally outs Jonathan and David's relationship. In other words, Jonathan was being told he was sexually confused and shaming himself by behaving like his mother rather than a man. Of course, there are other block logic issues within the text, like the metaphors of a double portion of foreskins, Saul's spear, and of course the firebrand relationship that all point to Jonathan and David. Now, there's another part to this story. This is from a Rabbi Mike Harvey, and I'm just going to use a little bit of what he says, but he uses the same scripture, 1 Samuel 18:1. Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul, nephesh, which is heart or life, of Jonathan was knit to, that's at nikshara, to tie physically or mentally in love, the soul, nephesh, of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Now the rabbi says the same thing. This is soul on soul love, a deep love. This is not a friendship or loving one's neighbor, but soulmates. And nikshara, this rabbi points out, is parsed in the perfect third feminine singular. There is a feminine aspect to Jonathan, a slim young man in contrast to David's masculinity. Now, moving ahead to the next verses, which we already read, but we're going to read them again. And Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. Now here's what's interesting about this. This rabbi points out, in the ancient Near East, there are three elements to a marriage: a parental exchange, moving from one house to another, a vow or covenant, and a gift. We see that clearly in this scripture. David moved into Saul's house. Jonathan made a covenant with him, and Jonathan gave him his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt as gifts. This was a secret marriage between David and Jonathan. Isn't that interesting? Okay, we're winding down. Now, I'm going to read to you, this is a Facebook post by Stan Mitchell, who is Mike and Josh. They're the pastors of the West Hollywood Church that are going to be our guests at 2 o'clock today. This is their pastor. He did a Facebook post that Mike saw and made a copy, and so I'm gonna read it here. Okay. Met with a young man this morning. His father pastors a good-sized evangelical church nearby. The 20-year-old has never told anyone he is gay, including himself, he says. That is, until last week, when his father finally broached the subject and the young man shared his truth. At some point in our time together, I told him about a conversation I had with my son a few years ago. In it, Stan was expressing his sadness for a gay friend of his from high school. His friend was almost completely bereft of support. My son was really about all he had. Somewhere in the course of that conversation, I asked Stan if he could possibly imagine how he would feel if God asked him to never touch a woman the rest of his life, to forfeit falling in love, raising a family, and living his life in a partnership of mutuality and deep caring with a woman. I continued by adding, what if God not only required that lifelong forfeiture, but also would ask him to find a way to do all of those romantic, intimate things with a man? This in spite of the fact my son is a heterosexual. Stan thought for a quiet moment and then thoughtfully said he probably wouldn't want to live. Stan and I were both silenced by the profound implications of the hypothetical scenario, and especially his response. I finally broke the silence by saying, exactly. And that is what millions of LGBTQIA+ Christians feel as a result of the church getting this terribly wrong. As I told the young man that story this morning, he also grew quiet and still. We sat there together, his eyes closed and our mouths the same. Finally, I noticed a few tears brimming and spilling from his shut eyes. Persisting in the silence for another long minute or two, he finally spoke, choking out the words. I tried to explain exactly that to my parents. My dad's response was, "Son, this is the cross life has given you to bear." After sitting with that for a moment, I asked my new young friend how he felt about what his father had said. He answered, I work with the youth at our church. I'm in school working toward a degree in ministry and already trying to decide which of our seminaries I will attend. I told my dad I had already picked up my cross to follow Christ. I had given my life to him. But now I wondered if there was another cross I would end up bearing, and that was learning how to be who God had created me to be without the approval of the people I love and need the most, even with their rejection. I didn't have anything to add, only grief, admiration, and support to offer. The young man is embarking on a soul-making journey for sure. After he left, I sat for a while thinking about Jesus' lament concerning religion gone bad, about religion that creates abusive burdens and refers to them as noble crosses, religion that makes unnecessary and cruel demands of beautiful young souls and calls those demands faithfulness and righteousness, religion that creates grievous collapses, many of which prove catastrophic, fatal even, and then blames those collapses on the collapsed one's sin that was never actually sin, that was actually one of the most beautiful parts of their life. I watched a young man today bending beneath an almost unbearable load. He was and is in danger of collapsing beneath its weight. That load is not a cross. It has nothing to do with Jesus, except that it is the very thing Jesus came to undo, the very thing that cost him his life. An unjust cross, a life snuffed out, if only for its beauty and goodness. My young friend is going to make it, but there is a tough journey ahead, and it shouldn't be that way. Can I have a Kleenex? Thank you.
Great.
Okay. Where do we go from here as a church? Okay, I'm talking us in this room and those watching online. Where do we go from here? As I said in the beginning, we want to have our attitude be, I may not understand, or I may not understand fully, but I want to be your friend. Love one another as I have loved you. We want to learn how to love everyone, even those that are different from us. We are, as a church, looking to become an inclusive church, which means we don't care if you're gay, lesbian, transgender, asexual, obese, anorexic, tall, short, black, or white. We welcome you with open arms, just as you are, with no judgment and no plans to change you. That's where I know that God is calling us. There's a website we're going to get our church name put on. I think it's Gay Church rainbowheart.org, and that's where people who are in the, the rainbow community go to look for a church in their area that will accept them. We want to get our name put on there. We're gonna change a little bit the wording on our website of our, belief system, to show that we are an inclusive church, and just wait and see what God does. So that's what I have. I'm actually early. I was afraid I was going to be like after 12. Now I do have one more slide. So that's the book, Walking the Bridgeless Canyon. There's an excellent video on Amazon Prime called Intersection, which talks about the intersex, what we talked about, Kleinfelters and all that. There's a YouTube video, that's the one I mentioned earlier, Through My Eyes. It's powerful stories of young gay Christians. That's a really good one to watch. And then I just found this guy, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, the one on the bottom there, but Homosexuality, the Bible, and Nuance. He has got a lot of good videos out there. If you find that, you find him, and then you just look at all his videos. I believe he's gay. And he's a pastor, I'm pretty sure. He runs a ministry. He's in leadership somehow. But he's got lots of really good videos about saying exactly what we've said today about how to open your heart to rainbow community people.